You are not struggling to find happiness. You're struggling against the silent, invisible instrument that society uses to perform a philosophical lobotomy on your mind every single day. We look back at the 1940s and shudder at the ice pick, the horrific surgical belief that you could cure agonizing psychological complexity by severing the frontal lobe, turning a screaming patient into a manageable, placid child. The horror wasn't just the destruction of tissue, it was the ultimate perverse trade. The absolute removal of suffering achieved by the absolute destruction of the self that suffered. But what if we told you that we, the modern, supposedly enlightened descendants of those surgical nightmares, have perfected the procedure? What if the lobotomy never disappeared but merely shed its surgical tools for psychological and algorithmic ones, evolving into the pervasive societal mechanism we call the lobotomy filter? This filter is the cultural consensus that difficulty is pathology, that pain must be medicated instantly, and that the only justifiable mental state is functional, predictable, and devoid of sharp edges. The modern project is not about seeking profound truth. It is about achieving systemic emotional management. We have traded the capacity for transcendent joy and devastating sorrow, the vertical axis of the human experience, for the flat, horizontal line of controlled contentment. The thesis is simple, terrifying, and undeniably true. The world has successfully convinced millions to sign the waiver for their own psychic mutilation, accepting comfortable numbness as a superior substitute for difficult meaning. We willingly submit to the filter because, unlike the victims of old, we see the procedure as a form of salvation, not destruction. If you are tired of being given shallow scripts and therapeutic cliches that obscure this brutal reality, and if you are ready to dissect the uncomfortable truth of what is truly happening to the modern mind, then subscribe now. Do not miss the rest of this essay. The original lobotomists were motivated by a desperate desire for order. Their patients were chaotic, unmanageable. They represented the unacceptable fringe of human suffering. The resulting silence, the blankness of the patient post-op, was interpreted as success. The internal storm was gone. This impulse, the hatred of internal chaos, is the spiritual engine of the lobotomy filter today. The filter works by eliminating sources of meaningful friction. It tells us that conflict is always toxic, that complexity is too exhausting, and that the only acceptable response to profound existential dread is distraction. Every algorithm tailored to maximize comfort, every curated social feed demanding positive vibes only, every piece of media designed to be consumed without requiring cognitive effort, these are the subtle hammers tapping away at the critical, reflective, and often agonized part of the self. The great casualty is the ability to sustain deep, uncomfortable thought. Depth requires resistance, the grinding of contradictory ideas against each other until a painful new insight is forged. The filter, however, offers us pre-chewed opinions and instant emotional gratification. It creates a psychological environment where the very act of sitting still with an unresolved question feels like a dangerous, unnecessary rebellion. We are no longer individuals wrestling with the eternal burden of consciousness. We are just data points being optimized for maximum complacency. The fear isn't that you might discover something terrifying about the universe. The fear successfully instilled by the filter is that you might discover something terrifying about yourself. A raw, untamed essence that cannot be categorized, managed, or sold back to you in pill form. We have become experts at avoiding the silence because in the silence, the unfiltered mind begins to scream its terrifying questions. And screaming is inconvenient for the machine. What the filter weaponizes is not merely laziness, but something far more potent: the inherent, agonizing burden of human freedom. To be fully conscious is to exist perpetually on the knife edge of ambiguity. We are forced to invent meaning in a universe that offers none, and this act of radical self-creation is terrifying. The filter steps into this existential vacuum and whispers the ultimate sedative: relax. The meaning has been provided. It is easier to outsource your moral compass, your intellectual curiosity, and your aesthetic judgment than it is to stand naked before the abyss and accept that only you can define your next step. The suffering we are trying to escape is the raw, visceral anxiety generated by unlimited possibility. When the world offers endless routes, the path of least resistance becomes the most attractive. The path that dictates what you should think, what you should fear, and what should make you happy, thereby relieving you of the catastrophic weight of deciding those things for yourself. This leads directly to the filter's most ingenious mechanism of control, the industrialization of wellness. The deep ache of existence, the inevitable grief, the crushing weight of systemic injustice, the necessary sadness of watching time pass is systematically pathologized. These are not inherent conditions of being human. They are defined instead as disorders or blockages that can be removed through a prescribed technique, a specific diet, or the correct set of affirmations. Real psychological growth demands suffering. It demands sitting in the difficult truth until it breaks you open. But the filter guarantees immediate superficial relief. It substitutes the hard work of internal transmutation with the effortless consumption of therapeutic language. We are now saturated in a culture of emotional diagnosis where every minor inconvenience is labeled trauma, and every momentary lapse in productivity is branded burnout. Not to validate genuine suffering, but to ensure that the solution always requires buying something, subscribing to something, or reducing complex internal reality to a simple, marketable label. If you find yourself recognizing this architecture of avoidance, if you are one of the few who still finds value in tearing down the comfortable illusions rather than building new ones, consider subscribing now. It is only by refusing the easy answers that we can begin to formulate the difficult questions, and supporting channels dedicated to complexity is the necessary friction we must reintroduce into the system. The tragedy is that we are not merely victims of this external mechanism. We have enthusiastically internalized the censor. The most effective filter is the one we willingly apply to our own perceptions, guarding the boundaries of our internal world against challenging input. We seek out echo chambers not just because they confirm our biases, but because they eliminate cognitive dissonance, that jarring, agonizing signal that tells you your worldview is incomplete or perhaps fundamentally wrong. We actively suppress thoughts that violate the established narrative of comfort, performing a preemptive psychological surgery on ourselves to ensure alignment with the collective complacency. This explains the extreme fragility of modern identity. If your entire self-concept is built on a foundation of pre-approved, friction-free ideas, the mere presence of a contradictory fact can feel like an existential threat, triggering not a moment of reflection, but a violent, defensive backlash. We are desperate to protect the investment we have made in the lie of effortless order, even when that order costs us our soul. We mistake validation for understanding, and the absence of challenge for genuine peace. The filter operates on the principle that the highest human aim is the mitigation of risk and the elimination of negative affect. But the great achievements of human history, intellectual, artistic, and moral, were forged not in serenity, but in the crucible of despair, doubt, and struggle. To remove the negative is not to elevate the positive. It is simply to flatten the emotional landscape into a vast, featureless plain of mild contentment. This is why the contemporary psyche feels so paper-thin. We have forfeited the necessary psychological ballast, the capacity for tragic contemplation, the acceptance of necessary loss that gives density and resilience to the self. We suffer today from a radical lack of gravity. When every serious philosophical inquiry is dismissed as doom-scrolling or negative energy, when genuine mourning is cut short by the imperative to move on and manifest abundance, we effectively deny the deep, structural reality of human limitation. We have traded the weight of being fully human for the light, ephemeral buoyancy of being perpetually distracted. The terrifying truth the filter masks is that the deepest well of meaning lies not in the pursuit of uninterrupted happiness, but in the profound acceptance of suffering as the price of consciousness itself. The cost of this psychological aversion to depth is an absolute moral simplification. We have lost the capacity for tragic heroes, trading them instead for sanitized idols who exist only to confirm our existing ethical biases. Look honestly at the way we consume history and contemporary critique. We do not engage with figures who are complex, conflicted, or morally ambiguous, which is to say, we no longer engage with human beings. We are engaged in a vicious project of moral retroactive editing, using the surgical tools of instant outrage to excise any figure whose flaws might complicate our easy narrative of progress. If they were complicated, if they wrestled with darkness, if their virtues were inseparable from their vices, we discard them. We insist on a moral purity that is impossible in the living world, because complexity itself demands effort. It demands that we hold two contradictory ideas in our mind simultaneously without dissolving into panic. We demand instant, pristine moral alignment, and anyone who fails this ahistorical, sterile test is canceled, not because they are evil, but because their existence introduces the psychic stress of nuance. This essay you are listening to right now is built entirely on navigating that dangerous, effortful ambiguity. Which is why, if you value this kind of uncomfortable analysis and genuinely believe that depth is worth the struggle, you should subscribe immediately because the algorithm is specifically designed to bury the inconvenient truths we discuss here. The real-world consequence of this purity demand is the destruction of genuine moral action. When you demand purity, you eliminate courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, nor is it the perfect execution of an ethical blueprint. Courage is the terrifying decision to act despite knowing you are flawed, and despite knowing that the consequences of that action will be ugly, complicated, and potentially misinterpreted by future generations, operating under a different, equally flawed set of assumptions. But the filter cannot tolerate this. It replaces the difficult act of moral choice with the effortless performance of moral signaling. Why venture into the actual political, interpersonal, or ethical fray, where you risk getting dirty, making enemies, or God forbid, being wrong, when you can achieve the same internal feeling of righteousness by simply declaring your allegiance to the most recently pre-approved ideological totem? The modern pursuit of virtue has become fundamentally risk-averse, a self-help strategy dressed up as social justice. The goal is not to fix the world, which is inherently messy, but to fix one's own internal moral ledger, ensuring that one is perpetually identified with the correct, safe side of every issue. This behavior is optimized for comfort and visibility, not effectiveness. True effectiveness requires confronting structures of power, which rarely happens without substantial personal sacrifice, and the willingness to accept that you might become the villain in someone else's story. The filter, however, guarantees you will remain the hero in your own perfectly curated feed, shielded from genuine opposition, and the corrosive doubt that is the hallmark of serious intellectual engagement. We have institutionalized a kind of intellectual cowardice where the greatest crime is not error, but complexity, and the highest virtue is not honesty, but unwavering, simplistic certainty. This is the death of wisdom, replaced by the sterile glow of validation. We mistake the loud uniformity of consensus for truth. This denial of internal friction leads us to seek external friction at the slightest provocation, which is precisely why public discourse has become so manic and volatile. We have suppressed the internal battles that historically gave rise to genuine maturity, the doubt, the contemplation, the negotiation between conflicting desires and duties. Since we cannot tolerate that darkness within, we must project it outward onto designated external enemies, whom we must then destroy with brutal efficiency, not to solve a problem, but to regulate our own psychological temperature. The intensity of modern outrage is inversely proportional to the difficulty of the actual action required. The less we are willing to risk in real life, the less we are willing to suffer for a principle, the more viciously we will attack strangers online for perceived ideological impurity. We are fighting shadows because we are terrified of fighting ourselves. The comfort we crave has made us weak, but crucially, it has also made us intensely cruel. The comfort we crave has made us weak, but crucially, it has also made us intensely cruel. This brings us to the great deception of our age, the substitution of moral theater for moral courage. We have convinced ourselves that the rigorous articulation of utopian demands, the crafting of the perfectly worded social media post, or the participation in highly structured, emotionally resonant public displays constitutes genuine sacrifice. It does not. Sacrifice, by definition, requires giving up something you actually value: time, security, comfort, reputation, or money, without the guaranteed return of validation. But modern virtue is cheap, requiring only the divestment of someone else's resources or the cheap expenditure of generalized righteous rage. We have confused aesthetic protest with structural resistance, mastering the language of revolution while remaining utterly terrified of its actual costs. We are experts in demanding purity while participating enthusiastically in a systemic mechanism designed for maximum psychological comfort and zero real-world risk. This is the lie we must aggressively dismantle. The fantasy that good intentions, loudly declared, are equivalent to effective action, quietly pursued. Real change requires confronting the brutal complexity of trade-offs, the necessary evil of compromise, and the persistent reality of human and material scarcity. But we reject these limitations because they threaten the pristine quality of our intentions. Instead of engaging with the messy, resistant substance of reality, we perform the ritualistic cleansing of language and symbols, believing that if we can just police the vocabulary strictly enough, if we can declare the problem solved in theory, reality will bend to our will. This is intellectual magical thinking, a regression to the belief that words hold occult power over material facts. We fail to notice that our performance is not only sterile, but fundamentally counterproductive, generating profound levels of noise that mask the quiet, persistent work required to move the needle even an inch. If you find yourself nodding to the uncomfortable clarity of this analysis, if this piercing critique feels like the necessary antidote to the pervasive, surface-level noise that defines current commentary and keeps you comfortably asleep, then this is the moment to actually subscribe. It is the only way this kind of relentless, uncomfortable exploration of psychology and power can continue to exist and bypass the algorithms and filters designed to suppress any idea that threatens the established moral comfort zone. The immediate self-congratulatory payoff of symbolic action is why we prioritize it, leaving us in a state of perpetual, ineffective agitation, forever focused on the metrics of affirmation, the likes, the affirmation, the viral circulation, rather than the messy, thankless reality of achieving actual results. The result is a profound ethical disconnect, where stated ideals are surgically separated from lived reality. We preach equity while practicing exclusion. We champion openness while enforcing rigid, unforgiving ideological walls. The individual moral ledger is kept impeccably clean, sealed away in the velvet box of good intentions. But the world remains as dirty and complicated as ever. In fact, the dirtiness of the world is now an essential ingredient in this psychological economy. It provides the perpetual fuel for outrage, the necessary contrast that allows the morally performing subject to prove, moment after moment, their own superior spiritual hygiene. The entire system has become a self-licking ice cream cone of self-righteousness, where the highest value is not making things better, but simply ensuring that you are not implicated in the worsening. We have become moral accountants, meticulously auditing the sins of others while refusing to look at the catastrophic expenditures of our own comfortable inaction. And the ultimate price of this comfort is not just weakness or even just cruelty, but a creeping, insidious incompetence that threatens to unravel the genuine mechanisms of social and political progress entirely. We have learned to love the spectacle of morality more than morality itself. The profound cruelty of this psychological economy is that it generates an internal state of perpetual, low-grade terror. The individual performing morality is terrified of one thing above all: being wrong. Not just ethically wrong, but tactically wrong in the brutal, instantaneous court of public opinion. This hypervigilance means they never achieve the state of moral peace they claim to seek. They are trapped in a vicious feedback loop where their self-worth is not derived from character or consequence, but is outsourced entirely to the latest trending hashtag and the approval of the digital mob. This external reliance creates a fundamentally brittle, reactive ego that can only define itself through opposition. It needs a necessary enemy, a necessary injustice. Because if the injustice disappears or if the enemy proves redeemable, their very identity collapses. This is the tragic, silent paradox that haunts the digitally righteous. The performance artist needs the suffering of others to sustain their own moral solvency. They cannot afford for the world to improve too quickly, lest their heroic role become redundant. This mechanism is far more intricate than simple hypocrisy. It is a complex psychological defense structure built specifically to insulate the self from the unbearable weight of genuine responsibility and the complexity of real change. True moral action demands sacrifice, risk, and the acceptance of imperfect, messy outcomes. Performative morality demands none of these. It only requires the fluency of the appropriate language and the correct signaling of allegiance. But this constant signaling is relentlessly exhausting. The individual is not freed by their self-proclaimed righteousness. They are enslaved by its maintenance. The moral athlete burns out precisely because they are running a marathon of validation, not a sprint toward tangible results, and the anxiety of being misread, misunderstood, or mislabeled by the collective judgment is paralyzing. If this level of unsparing, surgical deconstruction of the modern psyche is what you demand from your content, if you understand that we have to peel back these layers of self-deception to find the real levers of change buried beneath the noise, then you need to commit right now and subscribe. Supporting this channel is supporting the intellectual resources necessary to keep cutting deeper into the hidden architecture of human motivation, providing the antidote to the superficial analysis that dominates the mainstream. This psychological fragility translates directly into profound social and political paralysis. The overriding desire to maintain personal moral purity overrides the critical need for pragmatic effectiveness. Any policy, any strategy, any collaboration that involves necessary compromise, risks dirtying the hands, or might prove temporarily unpopular, is immediately discarded in favor of the clean, symbolic gesture. We have engineered a social environment that punishes effectiveness and rewards posturing. The result is the rise of a generation obsessed with auditing intentions, yet utterly incapable of navigating consequences. They mistake moral clarity for political competence, believing that stating a noble goal is the same as achieving it. But the world doesn't care about your intentions. It only responds to impact. The ultimate suffering delivered by this system is the quiet, horrifying realization that despite all the performative effort, despite all the noise, and despite the impeccable personal moral ledger, you have achieved nothing of substance. Having tragically mistaken the fleeting warmth of the spotlight for the heat of actual world-altering change, the moral performer lives in constant fear that the audience might look away, revealing the emptiness at the center of their ethical stage. This fear, this crippling anxiety of moral deficiency, scales upward from the individual to the institution, creating a sort of organizational autoimmune disorder where the entity begins viciously attacking its own components in the name of ideological integrity. If the goal is not material change, but the maintenance of collective moral standing, then the greatest threat is not the external problem you were founded to fight, but the internal dissent, the ideological deviation, or the historical imperfection of your own allies. Consider the brutal irony of countless reform movements and humanitarian organizations that now dedicate exponentially more resources to internal policing, auditing the language, the past associations, and the ideological nuances of their own staff, than they dedicate to the stated mission itself. They have entered what sociologists call the purity spiral, a process of competitive moral signaling where the only way to prove dedication is to denounce a slightly less pure ally, driving the threshold for acceptable orthodoxy ever higher until the movement collapses under the weight of its own unachievable standards. The external enemy, poverty, disease, corruption, is abstract and difficult, requiring messy, protracted engagement. But the internal enemy, the person in the next cubicle who used the slightly wrong term or holds an outdated political view, is concrete, immediately satisfying to target. and offers the performer the fastest, clearest path to visible virtue. We see this pathology manifest in real time in the political arena, particularly when dealing with truly intractable systemic issues, like housing affordability or persistent structural inequality. The moment pragmatic solutions are proposed, solutions that might involve deregulation, painful market interventions, or collaboration with ideologically impure partners, the moral performers recoil. They don't analyze the potential impact, they audit the political optics. A policy that would lift 1,000 people out of poverty but requires a temporary alliance with a political adversary is deemed morally compromised and therefore unacceptable, while the perfectly pure symbolic bill that achieves nothing but scores rhetorical points is celebrated. The actual suffering of the unhoused or the marginalized is weaponized as rhetorical fuel, but the moment a solution demands practical grit over symbolic clarity, the performance ends. The brutal, unforgiving truth is that the greatest casualty of the obsession with ethical perfection is ethical progress itself. It is a sacrifice of effectiveness on the altar of a self-congratulatory conscience. The world does not need more impeccable intentions. It needs more successful interventions, and success is inherently dirty, requiring the acceptance of trade-offs and the management of unavoidable moral ambiguity. The modern tragedy is confusing the noise of outrage with the labor of change, mistaking the volume of one's denunciations for the depth of one's commitment. This is the difference between performing morality and enacting justice. The distinction is fatal. We have entered an era where we have outsourced moral action to theatrical display, confusing the public audit of ethics with the actual, grinding labor of ethical practice. This is the final, sophisticated layer of human narcissism, making the suffering of others fundamentally about the refinement of our own conscience. The definitive verdict on this pathology is simple and unforgiving. The relentless pursuit of ethical purity is the single greatest obstacle to achieving genuine, large-scale moral improvement. Purity is a narcissistic trap that prioritizes the internal comfort of the performer over the external needs of the world. It is a luxurious refusal to engage with the actual messiness required for change. The systems that cause inequality, suffering, and collapse are complex, rooted in historical inertia and fundamental human flaws. They cannot be undone by a hashtag, a perfect denunciation, or a perfectly curated ideology. They require compromise, strategic ambiguity, the acceptance of necessary impurity, and the terrifying willingness to collaborate with people you may fundamentally disagree with for the sake of a marginal, tangible improvement. The truly moral person is not the one who screams loudest about the problem from a distance of immaculate safety, but the one who steps into the contaminated zone, risking their own clean reputation to pull one person out of the fire. The universe does not grade us on the impeccable nature of our intentions. It judges us solely on the cold calculus of our consequences. Therefore, we must stop confusing moral perfection with moral effectiveness. The demand for perfection is not bravery. It is a profound form of philosophical cowardice, a refusal to get one's hands dirty in the actual work of reality. The choice before us is clear and agonizing. We can remain perfectly pure symbols of resistance, admired by a shrinking internal circle while the real world burns. Or we can become effective, deeply compromised agents of change who accept the unavoidable stain of necessary trade-offs. Choose the stain. Choose the efficacy. The goal is not to be right. The goal is to make things better. If this ruthless commitment to effectiveness over performance resonates, if you are ready to discard the comforting lie of purity for the difficult truth of impact, then consider joining us. Subscribe now to become part of the community that chooses grit over grandstanding and reality over rhetoric. The final, unbearable truth is that the history of progress is not written by the immaculate. It is written by the tainted pragmatists who understood that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that the beautiful theory must always yield to the ugly necessity. If you truly wish to alleviate suffering, you must first accept that you cannot do so without becoming, in some small way, complicit in the very system you despise. Purity is merely the aesthetic comfort of the privileged observer. Effectiveness is the violent, often heartbreaking commitment to intervention. The world does not need more prophets of immaculate doctrine. It needs more surgeons willing to cut into the infected wound, knowing they will get blood on their hands. Therefore, the verdict is simple and agonizing. Moral cowardice is defined not by a fear of pain, but by a fear of responsibility for unintended consequences. We must stop waiting for a moral framework that absolves us of responsibility for our own necessary sins. That framework will never arrive. The great moral challenge of our time is learning to live not just with the evils of the world, but with the specific strategic evils we must commit or permit in order to prevent a greater collapse. The ethical life is not a clean ascent toward the light. It is a brutal trench warfare where victory is measured by marginal gains, and where the cost of every small success is paid in the currency of the soul. You must choose to be the one who bears that cost. If you are willing to face that darkness, if you understand that the deepest wisdom requires carrying that necessary stain without succumbing to cynicism, then you have found your tribe. Join us, and let us try to make things marginally better together. The final verdict, therefore, is that the moral calculus of our age has fundamentally inverted. In a collapsing world, inaction driven by the preservation of one's own clean conscience is not virtue. It is the highest form of negligence. Stop waiting for a leader or a philosophy that promises painless solutions. You must accept the weight. Look at your own hands, accept the blood already on them, and then decide how you will use them to build. This conversation is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be consequential. If this uncomfortable truth resonates, if you are willing to keep dissecting these impossible choices with us every week, then stay here. Subscribe now. Do not just observe the collapse, become one of the few dedicated to its marginal, messy repair. The world is not saved by saints, but by complex, compromised humans who choose action over ideological purity. This is the last great inversion. Your conscience is not a shield against the world's evils. It is the battleground where you must learn to stomach the necessary compromises. Therefore, the final agonizing verdict is this. Morality, understood as pristine adherence to principle, is a luxury the sinking ship cannot afford. Forget the flawless ideal. The only thing left to save is the practical reality. Stop trying to keep your hands clean. Start trying to make them useful. The truth you have sought is not an escape from darkness, but the tool that allows you to operate within it without being consumed by it. If you are one of the few who understands that the price of true wisdom is the loss of innocence, and if you are ready to join a community dedicated to analyzing the true cost of consequence, then make that intention official. Subscribe now and let us continue this necessary, terrifying work together. The lesson is simple. The moral life is not about avoiding sin. It is about choosing which sins you are prepared to carry for the marginal good of the world. Choose wisely and choose to act.